So this week on yogaembodiedonline.com in the yoga classes on the membership side, we are moving from the pelvis. So we can move the pelvis like, say if we are in a bit of a chair pose or we are sitting down, we can tuck the tailbone under if you like. We can lift the sitting bones. So we can rock the pelvis forward and backwards. We can, so you can do this with me, just to notice rocking forward and backwards. You can do this sitting down. We did that in another video as well. So sitting down, rocking forward and backwards, and you notice the whole of the spine will move. Now the other thing that at the minute has been static are the thigh bones. The pelvis moving on the thigh bones. So let's have a little look again. We have the pelvis, and we sometimes think, what is our hips? We think, oh, I have really wide hips, but what we think of the hips out here, so the wider part of the hips, are actually the thigh bone, the femur. So the femur moves all the way up. It has this big moving out bit here, and then it moves into the pelvis. So it's a ball and socket joint. So if you think this is the head of the femur or the thigh bone, it moves into this little socket, and then it can move around. But there's obviously the outside as well, the one that sticks out. And this is what we often in kind of our language say, oh, my hips are really wide. That's the feet, or part of the femur, part of the hip joint, or part of the, not the hip, part of the thigh. And obviously we have flesh and muscles to support this part. So when we move from the hips, really, it's right in there. And if this is a pelvis sitting like this, then the femur head moves into the socket quite deep in. So if you bring your hands to your hip points, as if you're just holding on to your hips, find your hip points, that sticky out bit, then you can move down the groin. And if you moved further underneath, you would find your sitting bones somewhere in between. It's almost like a natural dip. And then from here, having your feet, imagine your feet where your thigh bone would move into the hip socket. Then start to just bend one knee, move the knee out, move it back in, knee out, back in. So we'll just for the moment keep the pelvis level, but just move the thigh bone in the hip socket. Externally rotate it, neutral. Externally rotate it, neutral. Now, the interesting thing, obviously, as a ball and socket, is that potentially it could really move in all directions. Because it's a socket, it's a ball, so we could potentially move this in all different directions. But we have ligaments, we have muscles that might hold it in, and it should hold it in place as well. So we want always stability before flexibility. The hip socket here is shaped differently in everybody. So that might mean that for some people that externally rotation, I'm moving back a little bit more, that rotation, you'll start to move the femur head and it just stops because of where the hip socket stops. So bone on bone you can't do anything about. If it's because we're tight in our groin and our hip flexors, then we can start to stretch, we can start to strengthen, we can create mobility in our bodies. So let's just do a little bit more thinking about how the pelvis and the thigh bone moves. So we can stand up and just have the hands onto the hips. Have your feet a little bit, maybe shoulder distance apart, maybe soften the knees a bit. And then we'll take one hip forward. So now both the thigh and the hip moves, and we turn it all the way around, this half circle. Take that right hip back. Then the left hip comes forward, turn it all the way around and back. So it's like we make a little figure of eights. So we start to notice how the pelvis can move and how the thigh bone moves in the hip sockets. So again, potential for a lot of movement. We can stand up straight. We can bend the knee to the chest. We can rotate it out. We can even rotate it behind us and potentially even grab hold of the foot to push it back. So the thigh bone and the pelvis, part of them sometimes like this, the pelvis moves or do not necessarily have to move. Most likely when we step a leg back, the pelvis will also move a little bit. So when we move through the practices this week, be playful. We're just been moving through the chakras in the on the membership side. So, you know, I think this is the root chakra, the Svadhisthana chakra as well, the sacral chakra, earth and water, so mobility as well as stability. So be playful and just notice what feels good in your body. Notice what feels good, feels normal to you, feels challenging, and perhaps also what feels like what your body needs. Because sometimes what feels good is stretching too much. Sometimes what feels good is to not go too close to something that creates sensation. So simply explore.